In this video, you're going to learn some very important new concepts in ES6, which include iterators with the next method, generators, or generator functions. So to start, let's create an array. So I'm going to call it basket. And let's add some items to our basket. So I'm going to have strawberry, apple, yogurt, and bread. So you already know how to loop over the array and perform all sorts of things. So when you loop over the array, this is a form of iteration. So for example, we can do things like logging the elements of the array. All right. So we are looping over the array and we are performing an iteration. So this is what we call iteration. Now the array is called an iterable because it defines its iteration behavior when using a loop like this one. All right. So our array basket is iterable. All right, and here we are performing a loop or an iteration. So it's very important to understand these concepts. Okay, so an array is an iterable. So this is a good example of a JavaScript built-in type, which has its own default iteration behavior. All right, so other objects don't have that. We'll see later some data structures like maps, sets, and so on, which do have this feature, and so they are iterable, just like our array. Right? So in ES6, there is a new concept called an iterator. So an iterator can help you loop through an iterable object like an array. So here we've got our array. The iterator is going to be a separate object, which will help you loop over the array. Now the iterator can access items of your array or your collection. It can also keep track of its current position within the array. It also has got a method called next. This method will return the next item in the sequence starting from the first one. So when you call next for the first time, it's going to return the first item. And then you call it again, it's going to return the second item, and so on until you reach the end. So next is going to return something as far as you've got items still left in the iterator. So every time you call it, it's going to return an object with a couple of properties, value, which is the value of the item, and done, which is going to be either false or true. So if items are still available and you return an item, then done is going to be false. If there are no items left in the iterator, then done is going to be false. Now, an easy way to understand this is by looking at a built-in iterator. All right, so there is a method which creates an iterator out of an array in ES6. So this is going to be a built-in method creating an iterator out of an array. So let's call it array iterator like this, and the method is entries. So the entries method returns a new array iterator object that contains the key value pairs for each index in the array. All right, so let's try it and see what we get. So you can see that you got an array iterator. All right, so now what we need to do, we need to start calling the method next of the iterator just to understand what's going on. So I'm gonna log the output of the next method like this. So you can see now that we are having an object with a couple of properties, value and done. So this is the first item. The value is an array. It's got a couple of elements, 0 and strawberry. So this is referring to the index and the value of the first item. Now, to present things clearly, you can use a JSON string like this. And now you can see the value of this property. It's an array, and done is false. Now, if you call next again, you get the next item again and again. And if you call it now, you get only done true because there are no items left in the iterator. All right, so this represents how we defined an iterator at the beginning and how we defined the next method. And this is a really good example to understand the concept of an iterator. So again, when we called next for the first time, it returned the first item. Then we called it again, it returned the second item, and we carried on until the end where there are no items left, and it returned done set with a value true. All right, so now here is a quick challenge for you. So you would need to build a function, okay, that makes an iterator out of an array. So you can call this function something like create iterator, and it takes an array, and it's going to return an iterator object. And remember, the iterator object has got to have a method next. So when you return the object, it's going to be like something like this with a next method inside. So now the values that you return when calling the next method, they don't have to be like this. So in our case, we call the method entries, and the values are arrays showing the index and the value. Now, if you try, instead of entries, you tried the values, then it's going to return an iterator, and instead of the index and the value, you get only the value. Okay, so let's comment this one now. So now we can see only the values. Now, there is another option. You can return the indexes using the keys method. All right. So instead of values, we're getting the keys. So for now, let's just keep it values. And let's say that you want to create a function that returns something like this. All right. So I suggest you pause the video here, create the function, and come back once you're done. All right, so hopefully you managed to find the solution. So let's use the ES6 syntax instead of this one. So as you can guess, we're gonna return a closure here because we need to keep track of the index. So we're going to have a variable index defined just before the return statement. So the next function is going to be a closure which has got access to its outer environment where we're storing the index variable. So let's define next. So let's use the ES6 syntax again. So first, we're going to check if the index is still within the array's length. So if the index is less than the length of the array, then we're going to return something like this. If the index becomes too big, this means that we reached the end of the array, and that means that we're going to be returning done true. So if the index is less than the array or the array's length, we're going to return the object value and done like this. Otherwise, we are going to return done true. So the value here is going to be the element of index, right? Which is array and then index. And then done set to false. Now every time we return something, we're going to need to increment the index by 1. Now the problem is we've got a return statement here. So you can either define a new variable and call it temp, where you store the index, then use temp right there and increment index like this. Otherwise, you can use the same code we used before, and once you use index, just add a ++ there, and this will increment index. All right. So let's try our code. I'm going to define a new iterator, call it array iterator 2, and we're going to use our function creates iterator, and our arguments this time is going to be a simple array like that. So I'm using const here. We can use const there as well because the iterator doesn't change actually. So now if you log the output of the next method, this is what you get. Right, so value 1 and then false, then you call it again, value 2, and again, value 3, and finally, you get done true. Perfect. Now, ES6 comes with some special functions which define iterative algorithms. So this will spare you the time of creating functions like create iterator. So the special functions are called generator functions or generators. So these generator functions, they are actually a factory of iterators. They create iterators basically. So let's create a generator function that returns iterators. So you will need to use the keyword function star like this. So whenever you see function star, then you would need to know that it is actually creating iterators. So let's call this function generate iterator. Right. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to have a few lines of code, and we're going to ask the function to return or yield a certain value and pause. And this will imitate, or this will create actually the behavior of the iterator. So what's going to happen is that we're going to have one line of code, and then we're going to yield something. And you can understand what yielding means exactly. So for example, let's just log something like running, and then yield 1. So here we are actually pausing the generator. And we do that using the keyword yield. And this is the value that you will get when you use the next method. And then if you carry on and you log running again, and then yield another value, that value is going to be thrown if you call the next method again. So let's try this. So let's create an iterator, call it it, and use the generator function to create that iterator. So let's call next first and see what we get. Here we go. So the first value is 1 and done is false. So we are pausing right there. Now let's call it again. Now the value is 2, which is that one, and done is false. Now if you call it again, we don't have any other yield statement, and this time the value is undefined and done is true, meaning that we came to the end of our iterator. So again, this is a simple function creating iterators. So the variable it stores an iterator which we created using that function. And you can see that when you call the method next, you see the same behavior that you would get if you call or you create an iterator out of an array using one of the methods that we covered earlier. So this was a quick introduction to generators in ES6. Now, in coming videos, you will see at some point an advanced section where we cover generators in even more detail. But now you can just remember that when you create a generator function like this, you can actually run a few lines of code, then pause at some points. All right. So here we run the first line and we paused and we returned this value and done object. And then when we called next again, we run that line of code and then we returned 2 and false. And at the end, we just returned undefined and true.